The development of modern weapons is believed to have begun in 1364 when the first recorded firearm was used. This continued until 1892 until automatic handguns made their appearance. Over the millennia, people have come up with very interesting weapons. Some have been a huge success, while others have been a complete waste of time and money. And today, it's those military inventions we'll take a look at. Here are the most useless military inventions. Hey guys, it's your host for today, American Eye. But before we get into it, make sure you subscribe to Titanic, and if you like today's content, be sure to check out my channel, American Eye. We'll see you there. The Sanchalan Tank. This was the first time France attempted to build a tank, and it was dismal. Tanks were not meant to be fast, but they were meant to be faster than the 7-mile-per-hour Sanchalan Tank could travel. This tank had 12 tons of armor and ammunition, and with a crew of 9, but couldn't reach speeds needed for war. The shape of the tank was odd, which didn't help for mobility. It's obvious a battlefield isn't a paved road, so it wasn't very useful to the French. 400 tanks were manufactured, and each tank had to have a mechanic on board to fix the countless mechanical problems that the tank suffered. Enemies could easily reach the tank and throw grenades and satchel charges at them. The Flugel. This invention was meant to curb a specific problem that the Germans were experiencing. Near the end of WW2, Allied bombers were causing severe damage in Germany. Airfields were hit the hardest, making it difficult for the Germans to get their planes into the sky. This design was meant to take off vertically and fly fast, posing a threat to anything airborne. That was all great, except that landing the Flugel was almost impossible. It was possible, but it was like reversing a giant rocket-powered station wagon into a tight spot. Not user-friendly at all. The Tank VZ33. This is often called the tank that could not tank. The purpose of tanks was to be well-armored giant all-terrain vehicles that could destroy anything in its path. So, the Czechs who designed this decided to forego the traditional specs and do the exact opposite. They bought some British post-WW1 Cardin Lloyd tankettes and used them as a template for their own. They were small, and it wasn't to try to trick the enemy into thinking that the tanks were further away than they were. It was purely a financial decision. The smaller tanks cost less. The Tanks were well armored and only had 2 machine guns, which could have done better if they had a soldier running on foot. Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Not a weapon, but a costly part of the war was Hitler's Atlantic Wall. After France was conquered, Hitler had his fortification built at a cost of $200 billion in today's money. It was built along the Atlantic coast and was manned by over 250,000 Germans. The fortification was built using slave labor, along with 1.2 million tons of and 17 million cubic meters of concrete. It's considered to be one of the biggest wastes of money ever, and General Erwin Rommel declared the wall a farce, which it certainly is. The Panjandrum. This looks like it would have been used in a mill as opposed to a weapon of war. It was meant to be used against the beach defenses of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It was built with 2 rocket-propelled wheels that held together a cylinder filled with explosives. It was launched from a landing craft and could race up the beach and destroy anything in its way. Tests were done in 1943 and 1944. Both were failures. The rockets wouldn't explode properly or would fall off. It hardly ever went into a straight line, making it even more of a hindrance than a help. The Lantern Shield. Now we go back to the Italian Renaissance, where it became popular to compete in duels using the lantern shield. They were round bucklers with a lantern attached. A leather flap covered the lantern. The point was that the leather flap opened, the light would dazzle the enemy, giving the attacker the advantage. More advanced lantern shields had built-in spikes or blades. So why was this a poor design? Those days, lanterns needed oil to work, and anyone knows oil and fire do not mix well. When the shield was strapped to the arm, the fire and oil would mix closely to the wearer. Often the oil would leak, drenching the user, and the moment the flame was ignited would result in a human torch. Not an ideal situation at all. The Mary Rose. Commissioned in 1511, the Mary Rose was one of the ships that supported several portholes on either side for the cannons. Before this, one had to board an enemy ship in order to take control. This ship could fire between 30 and 50 cannons. In 1536, it was decided to upgrade her and add more cannons. This would take her weight from 500 tons to between 700 and 800 tons. The ship underwent its modifications and started firing at French galleys, only to encounter a stiff breeze. That was the end of the ship. She rocked a bit, and the weight of the cannons tilted her, and everything went down, with 90% of the crew drowning. The Sticky Bomb. It sounds like a type of delicious candy, but it's an infamous weapon from WW1. These were used by the Home Army in Britain, who were too old to be at the front line. The grenades had 2 triggers and a pin, and the first pin would need to be pulled to expose a layer of adhesive. This would activate the second pin and the firing mechanism, which would take 5 seconds to explode. The major issue was the adhesive would often stick to the person pulling the first pin. And I think that's about as much information as we need. Strategic Defense Initiative. The initiative was announced by Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech and was meant to be a space program consisting of lasers and satellites that could take down any nuclear missile intended for the US. The end result? $150 billion thrown into a bottomless pit of research, political tension, and ridicule. The Krumlov. The concept was sound, a gun that could fire around corners. It was designed for the German Sturmgewehr 44 or ST-44 assault rifle. The problem at the time was that the barrel attachment distorted and didn't last long, making it financially unviable. Not all was lost, and modern designs have allowed for more user-friendly designs that don't wear down as quickly as the original. 1796 Spadroon. This was a standard weapon for the British Army, which they used throughout the Napoleonic Wars. The design was straight-bladed, single-edged, and flat-backed, which all sounds good on paper, but that wasn't the problem. The hilt was better suited for a small sword, making this large sword ergonomically unfriendly. If the officer was able to overcome the first obstacle, he would have a problem making an incision to the enemy. The blade was super flexible, so thrusting proved to be a challenge. The point of the sword wasn't even sharp enough, and the hilt was designed in such a way that it would pinch the user's hand. How they managed with them at all is still a mystery. The Russian Tsar Tank. There was plenty of trial and error when it came to the first tanks, and often mechanical issues were more of an issue than an attack by the enemy. Russia clearly made a bad choice in the designer of their tank. Their first tank had little power and was open to artillery fire. It would never have managed on a battlefield. Turning this beast was damaging its wheels, and it could only fire straight ahead and was very slow. It's a good thing the project was scrapped before anyone attempted to use this in battle. The Mark 14 Torpedo. This torpedo was a US Navy standard submarine launch torpedo, but it was so bad that the Great Torpedo Scandal became a thing. Designers and testers of this stud of a torpedo took no responsibility. 7 out of 10 were a failure. Some were pure duds, some missed, and others had faulty depth sensors. They tested some of these torpedoes in the North Atlantic, but used them in the South Pacific, where magnetic influences were completely different. The Hiller Flying Platform. Ambitious in design, this unusual craft took flight for the first time in 1955. It had a round platform with a rotor allowing direct lift. The pilot could steer the craft by leaning his body in the direction he wanted to go. All very well, but imagine this thing flying above enemies. I'm sure you're seeing the problem too. It's nice to know that it wasn't a complete failure and that it was the inspiration behind the hovercraft design in the 1960s. The B-1. This sticks out of Air Force history like a sore thumb. Developed in the 1970s, it was meant to replace the aging B-52. 4 prototypes were made, and then the project was canceled in 1977. President Reagan revived the project, and 100 were built. The planes were plagued by various issues, and they didn't drop a bomb until 1998. It took a while before the planes were useful, but at a cost of over $250 million per plane, it hardly seems worth it. The Maus. The Panzerkampfwagen, or Maus, was Hitler's giant tank designed by Ferdinand Porsche. The idea was brought forward in 1942, but the German High Command did not believe that a 200-ton tank was a necessity. Despite that, trials began in 1943. There were many problems with the tank, including the poor top speed of 12 miles per hour or 20 kilometers per hour. 150 tanks were meant to be built, but only 2 prototypes ever made it to production. The Xuxa. This was a light machine gun used by the French army and considered one of the poorest firearms to be mass-produced. Inferior quality materials were used, and the design and workmanship were both poor. Introduced in 1915, the Xuxa did have some advantages. It was light enough to be used by an individual, and it was inexpensive to make. The problems that were noted were the following. The detachable magazine had one side open, allowing for dirt, mud, and loose earth to get inside. This would jam and stop the firearm from working. The ejection port didn't have a cover either, which also meant that dirt got inside, often jamming the gun. Overheating was also a problem, sights were misaligned, and the design was far from ergonomic. By 1918, the Xuxa was being phased out. The Bob Semple Tank. This was introduced by New Zealand during WW2 when they were concerned that the Imperial Japanese might invade. National defense wasn't something they usually worried about, so when they heard about tanks, they decided it was time to get their own. They wanted to get tanks from Britain, but they couldn't assist, so they decided to build their own. The tank was cumbersome, slow, and heavy. It had to change gears and was made from indigenous materials, making it far from bulletproof. The tank would vibrate so badly, it was difficult to aim its 7 machine guns fixed to it. The tank did make a great addition to the parades though. The Gyrojet. The concept behind this weapon was spectacular, a pistol that shot rockets instead of bullets. Developed in the 1960s, it even made its way into the James Bond movie, You Only Live Twice. The weapons were light and powerful, but proved useless in war. Like big rockets, they start up slowly and gain speed as they go. This meant that the enemy had time to either shoot back or get out of the way. On top of that, accuracy was also not possible. Which of these do you believe to be the most useless military invention? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Number 1. Army Combat Uniform. In 2004, the US Marine Corps spent $5 billion developing and producing a new uniform. The uniform was meant to be the ultimate in camouflage and could be used in any environment. It was a huge failure, and the Army stopped wearing them, claiming the pixelated design made them stick out as opposed to blending in.